Hey guys, welcome to another video. In this video, I'm going to be making the much requested Mandalorian helmet. The templates can be downloaded for free. However, I did not make the templates myself. I got the templates from Dustin McLean. There's a link to his video in the description where he also makes this exact same helmet, so go check that out if you would like another tutorial. Dustin based his design off of the one that was originally created by Punished Props Academy. There is a link to their video in the description as well. I would also like to point out that Dustin made two different versions of this helmet. There is an EVA foam version and a cardboard version. And ironically, I'm actually going to be using his cardboard templates to make an EVA foam helmet. Overall, this helmet is exactly the same as the one that he made on his tutorial. I did add a few little detail pieces here and there that weren't on his template, but they are so simple that I don't think it merits a whole new template. There are plenty of ways that you can customize your own Mandalorian helmet, so there's no need to feel like this is the only way that it can be done. Now, looking at the templates, you can see that they are very nicely arranged, and you can tell where all of the parts are supposed to join together. You'll want to write all of this down onto the foam so that you don't get pieces confused with one another. Just like with the rest of the build, I'm using 6mm thick EVA foam, and I am using his cardboard helmet templates. Once you have all of the templates cut out, you'll want to arrange them in order and make sure that you have all of them, and make sure that you didn't cut off any of the lines where it says to bevel it. Those will be pretty important, especially in the face area, so you'll want to make sure that you cut it where it says to cut it. It can be a bit tricky getting all of these little templates to fit onto sheets of EVA foam, so if you are using the exact same EVA foam that I've got here, then you can arrange them like this. This was the best way that I could get them to fit onto two sheets of EVA foam. Now, I recommend transferring the templates over to the foam using a thin tip Sharpie. I think the thicker tip ones just kind of bleed over the edge too much, and in this situation you really don't have a lot of extra space, so the thin tip Sharpie works best. I also recommend using a metal ruler when you have straight edges that you can cut. A lot of these edges are rounded, so you can't really use a ruler, but where you can, I recommend it. I will say that when you're cutting out the parts for the dome of the helmet, you'll want to make extra sure that you don't bevel them, because if you do, you'll end up with some weird pointy angles on the dome, and you don't want that. You want it to be as round and smooth as possible, so try to just cut straight up and down. So now I'm going to go ahead and assemble parts of the dome. You'll want to make sure that everything lines up before you stick it all together. For this project, I'm going to be using rubber cement. This type of glue is made by Elmer's, and it is definitely not as strong as the contact cement that I have been using. However, I have found that if you brush it on multiple times instead of just once, then it will actually make it stronger. I'm not sure if I can call this a true substitute for contact cement yet, but I'm going to test it out on a few future projects just to see. The biggest difference between contact cement and rubber cement is the smell. The contact cement has a very strong odor, and it's definitely not a good substance you want to breathe in. On the other hand, this rubber cement is definitely not as toxic, and I believe this product is aimed at children, so if you are a younger builder, then I would definitely suggest checking this out over contact cement. Now for these dome sections, I'm going to heat them up with the heat gun first and heat form them, and this is where EVA foam really shines. You can bend it in multiple directions and it will keep its shape. The way in which you apply rubber cement is exactly the same as with contact cement. You first need to brush it onto both surfaces that you wish to glue together, and then let that dry. And then you can stick them together after about 5 minutes. But with this stuff, like I said before, you'll want to make several passes with it. So brush it on multiple times and let it dry, and then brush it on again. I'd say at least 2 or 3 times, because this stuff is not as strong as contact cement. Now when you are gluing the pieces together, you want to make sure that they are level with each other, because if one is kind of above the other one, then it will create like a step effect, and you don't want that. You want them to be as even and smooth as possible, especially on this dome section. So now we're going to make the back and sides of the helmet. I'm first going to heat them up and curve them a little bit, just to give them a little bit of shape before we stick them together. If you look at the template, some of the edges are intentionally straight and some of them are rounded just slightly, so you'll want to make sure that the rounded edges stay rounded, or else it will change the shape of the helmet. And this part can be a little confusing because a lot of the pieces look very similar, so make sure that you write down on the pieces exactly where they're supposed to match up, and gluing them all together should be fairly straightforward. I'm going to use rubber cement once again. So now that the back and sides of the helmet are completed, we can go ahead and stick the dome onto it. And if the back side of the helmet looks a little wavy to you, don't worry, that's supposed to be there. As you'll see, I'm actually gluing one side of the dome on at a time. I recommend doing this before gluing the whole dome section together, just because it's easier to work with while it's still in its half form. And now that both sections of the dome have been glued onto the back and sides of the helmet, we can go ahead and combine both halves of the dome to create one large piece. Now we're going to make the most difficult part of this helmet build, the face sections. There are a lot of complex angles and curves on this piece, and what makes it more difficult is the fact that there's two of them in opposite directions, so you have to not only do this difficult shape one time, but also do it in reverse on the other side. And getting them to be symmetrical can be very tricky, so I highly recommend making one and then looking back at it while you're making the second one. Also, as you can see, I'm using my secret beveling technique, which is to use these little flesh cutters that you can get at hobby stores and snip off the excess foam. The results are not very pretty, but since it is going to be on the inside of the piece and you won't actually see the bevel, it doesn't really matter as long as it's at the right angle. Now, some of these face pieces are a bit trickier than others because they're at a rounded bevel, and this is where the hobby model kit cutters come in handy again. They are very good at handling rounded corners, whereas beveling with your knife would be pretty tricky. It can be done, but you have to have a very sharp knife and a very steady hand in order to keep it all in the same angled slope. Now we're going to move on to gluing the face pieces together. Since a lot of these pieces that are being glued together are beveled angles, you have to make sure that you hold them in place and make sure they don't slip and go too far. I decided to try some different glues for this section, particularly hot glue and super glue, because I didn't think the rubber cement was going to hold properly. It probably would have worked okay, but there were so many complicated curves and angles in this section that I didn't want to risk it. Another thing that you'll want to make sure that you understand is the difference between under-beveling and over-beveling something. These are both listed in the templates, but a under-bevel is where you bevel it slanted underneath the foam, whereas an over-top bevel is where you cut with the slant of the bevel facing upward. So try not to get those two confused, and if you need to, look back at the template just to make sure that you're beveling it in the right direction. Now we're going to glue these two sections onto the sides of the helmet in order to form the front of the helmet. Now this little strip of foam that I'm going to add to the top of the helmet is not in the template, but it is just a simple 2mm strip of foam that I'm going to wrap around that brow section just to add a little bit of depth to the helmet. There is something similar in the template, but I decided to add this piece on my own. In the same way as that top piece, I'm going to reuse one of the templates for the front part of the face section and create some 2mm pieces that are just like it, and I'm going to glue those right on top of the face parts in order to give the helmet some more depth. 2mm thick EVA foam is a great way to add detail to your pieces, so if you would like to raise certain details, you can create a little copy with 2mm foam and just extend that piece a little bit to make it stand out more. So now we're going to make these little pieces on the sides of the helmet. Some Mandalorian helmets have antennas attached to them, and this is where you would add one, but since this template is based off of the Din Djarin helmet, I am not going to add one to this helmet, but you could if you wanted to. This piece is going to be a combination of two of the same pieces cut out of 6mm foam, and then I'm going to add some little details with 2mm foam. Now this helmet is not going to be exactly the same as the original or as the template would have you build it, but I'm going to customize it a little bit and just add some detail pieces on as I see fit. But if you would like to build the exact same Din Djarin helmet, then I would recommend going and checking out the video tutorial by Dustin McLean that I linked in the description. Now I'm going to go ahead and start gluing some of these pieces onto the helmet. I also cut these little strips of foam that I'm going to add as details as well, which is not part of the template, but they are easy enough to replicate. I would like to point out that when you're gluing these side pieces on, you want to try and keep them as parallel as possible to the rest of the helmet and like the face guard, because if they're slanted it will kind of look weird. It's pretty important throughout this build to double check everything and make sure that it's all lined up. Also, I would like to point out that this piece I'm gluing on right now is not part of the template, but a lot of other Mandalorian helmets have this band around the backside of the helmet. Plus I wanted to hide the seam line a little better, so I decided to wrap this piece of 2mm foam around the back. Now this back vent piece that I cut out off camera is very simple. It may look complicated, but it's actually just 2mm pieces of foam surrounded by a block of 6mm. It's very similar to the one from the template, so you could use that one, but this one is just a little different. After you cut out each individual little vent piece, you can glue them together at the tips to create this staircase-like effect, and that will slot nicely into this 6mm box. Now I'm going to glue on a helmet fin, which is just a piece of 6mm foam. This is a little more simple than the Din Djarin style helmet fin, which is the one you can find in the template. This will definitely help hide the seam line down the middle, but unfortunately there's not a great way to hide those other seam lines, apart from just using spackling. Now we're going to handle the visor section of the helmet, and for this I'm going to be using a replacement face shield welding visor, which can be found on Amazon. but this is the thinner type of visor. It is 0.004 inches thick, as opposed to the one that is 0.006 inches thick, which is thicker and much harder to cut. Since there is a plastic wrap around this welding face shield, you can write on it with a silver Sharpie like I'm doing here, and it will create the outline where you need to cut it, and then you can just peel that off and the visor will be totally fine. As you saw, you can take a piece of tape and tape down the middle section of the visor template, and then just flip it over when you need the second half. This is a much easier way to get the full shape of the visor. The visor is technically thin enough where you can cut it with scissors. However, I don't recommend that on these curved sections, just because cutting the curves is a lot more tricky than cutting in a straight line. What I actually recommend doing is using an X-Acto knife and just scoring the top part of the visor, and that way you can snap it off, as you'll see me do in a little bit. Now I'm going to heat up the visor and bend it in a way that will allow it to curve around the helmet a little better and prevent the helmet from bowing outward. Since it is a foam helmet, it is very flexible, and this hard visor will cause the helmet to flatten outward in a way that makes it look too wide. So in order to prevent that, I'm going to heat it up and just get it in the right shape before I put it in. Now when you're heating this up, make sure that your hand is not in front of the heat gun directly, and you'll want to wear a glove of some kind to reflect the heat. Also, make sure that you peel off the protective plastic coating before you heat up the visor, or it will melt it to the visor and it will be very hard to get off. Now before you glue in the visor, you'll want to make sure that everything lines up, and you can tape it into place with some regular tape before you do this. This will help you get a better idea of what it will look like in the end. Now I'm going to glue in the visor, and I'm going to start with these tips on the very end. This is where I recommend starting with, as you will know exactly how far down the visor will go, because you don't want to put it in at the top and then have it go too far down at the bottom. I'm also going to be using hot glue in this case, because hot glue has mass and it will take up space, which will help kind of hold the visor to the sides of the helmet better. I would then recommend gluing in the top middle section and then gluing on the sides last. You should also put in a little bit of glue around the cheek pieces just to hold them down a little better as well. Now, just like with the Clone Trooper helmet, it does not sit exactly on your head, so you'll want to add some padding on the inside to help get it comfortably sitting where it should. This type of foam is padding foam. You can find it in craft stores, but it's very flexible and spongy-like and makes for a great pillow-like comfort. This stuff can be a little tricky to glue in, as it is very spongy-like. It can actually absorb the hot glue that you may glue on it, so you'll want to be very careful that you don't push it into the helmet when you glue it in place. Just set it down in place and let the glue dry around it. Don't let the sponge absorb it, or else that pad will just dry up and fall off. So that's it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like and comment below, and if you want to see more videos like this one, feel free to hit that subscribe button. Once again, this template was created by Punished Props Academy and modified by Dustin McLean. Both channels are listed in the description, so go ahead and check them out. I highly recommend both of them. If you have questions, feel free to leave them below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.